In the mid-1940s, members of a tiny religious sect are campaigning door-to-door for converts in Quebec, the most Catholic province in Canada. The missionaries will be denounced, beaten by mobs, and jailed by the hundreds. They zealously spread the word of God. They make enemies of a man whose word is law in Quebec. This religious war will destroy one man's life, provoke censure from the highest court in the land, and will define every Canadian's right to religious freedom and free speech.
Vous étiez dans une époque très catholique. Et la religion, à l'époque, autant chez les protestants que chez les catholiques, est excessivement importante. C'est quelque chose de très, très fragile, je dirais, lorsqu'on touche à ces questions-là dans les années 40 et 50. Alors, il faut bien comprendre que ce n'est pas le contexte d'aujourd'hui. La religion n'a pas la valeur aujourd'hui qu'elle avait à cette époque-là.
In a province where 85% of the population is Catholic, the Church has guided public policy on health, education, social, and moral issues. But it is now slowly losing power to the provincial government under newly elected Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis.
Quand Duplessis disait que les évêques mangent dans sa main, je pense que c'est une caricature peut-être, mais qui est caractéristique de ce qui se passait à l'époque. Donc le pouvoir politique, les évêques étaient dépendants du pouvoir politique.
A devoutly religious man, Maurice Duplessis declares he heads the only Catholic government in North America. Religious minorities accept the balance of power in Quebec and stay within their own institutions and houses of worship. All except one group that has only 450 members in the province, the Witnesses of Jehovah. They will challenge the way Duplessis runs the province. They prepare a crusade in Quebec in the spring of 1945.
Les témoins de Jéhovah ont décidé de faire une campagne en 1945 au Québec, un endroit où ils avaient peu d'adeptes. C'est une secte qui a pris son emprise davantage dans l'ouest du Canada. Les témoins de Jéhovah avaient eu de la difficulté aux États-Unis, ont eu de la difficulté en Ontario, et effectivement, en arrivant au Québec et en s'attaquant directement à l'Église catholique.
Jehovah's Witnesses say the one true God, Jehovah, is one spiritual body, that Satan influenced the Catholic concept of the Holy Trinity. The Witnesses believe only their interpretation of the Bible leads to salvation. And like the early apostles, they go to where people live to spread their word.
Donc, ils ont des méthodes différentes. Ils vont dans les maisons, ils font de la sollicitation, ils vont répandre leur message un peu partout. Ce qui n'est pas usuel dans la façon de procéder dans les religions au Canada. C'est généralement les fidèles qui vont à l'Église, et non l'Église qui va vers les fidèles jusqu'à un certain point.
You would have a territory, and you would work just the streets on that territory, and somebody else would have another territory, and they would work that street. And we would go to the door, and we would say, "Bonjour, madame, je travaille en collaboration avec les témoins de Jéhovah. Savez-vous que tout le monde sont maintenant dans l'incertitude, ils s'amaillent de l'avenir menaçant?"
John Howe's frequent partner is Laurier Saumur.
Le travail de maison en maison, c'était pour localiser ces personnes-là qui s'intéresseraient au message que la Bible donne. On utilisait la Bible de l'abbé Crampon, qui était une Bible catholique, parce que la plupart des gens croyaient qu'on avait une Bible spéciale.
To most people, Jehovah's Witnesses are a nuisance. For the Catholic Church, they are a nemesis to be eradicated. From their pulpits, priests denounce them as heretics. They are shunned by Quebec society.
Oh, c'était un peu difficile. Les gens, on nous a traqués comme des bêtes de somme. C'était vraiment difficile. Le clergé avait une peur morbide des témoins de Jéhovah parce qu'ils avaient peur de perdre le contrôle. J'ai eu des problèmes moi-même, le clergé par exemple, les prêtres, un prêtre est arrivé vers moi avec une foule de garçons, de badauds là qu'on appelle en français, et qui sont venus, puis il m'a même donné un coup de poing dans l'estomac.
The harassment extends into classrooms. Thérèse Boucher is just learning what it means to be a Jehovah's Witness in Duplessis, Quebec.
J'ai été refusée à l'école parce que je voulais pas faire le signe de croix. Ça fait que c'est là que je me suis rendu compte, moi, plus qu'on était différents. Puis on faisait rire de nous autres aussi.
Jehovah's Witnesses are undeterred. They step up their campaign, distribute pamphlets, conduct more meetings, and begin preaching over loudspeakers. Formal complaints begin reaching Quebec's Attorney General, who also happens to be Premier Maurice Duplessis.
Étant donné que Maurice Duplessis, qui est procureur général du Québec, qui est responsable donc de l'ordre public, va se sentir obligé ou de sentir le besoin d'intervenir afin de calmer la population. Probablement, la suite de pression également que des membres du clergé, autant catholiques que protestants, ont pu faire à son égard pour qu'il intervienne pour mettre fin aux activités ou à tout le moins tempérer l'activité des témoins de Jéhovah.
Duplessis declares Jehovah's Witnesses enemies of Quebec society, saying they're agents of communism. Many believe him.
Quand on est à la station, on allait faire notre épicerie, là, on se faisait traiter toutes sortes de noms. Les communistes, dans ce temps-là, ils nous appelaient communistes.
Of course, we had nothing to do with communism, but that didn't stop Duplessis. He made his words to Duplessis meant whatever he wanted them to mean.
Duplessis threatens Jehovah's Witnesses with a law originally meant to curb communism. The Padlock Law authorizes the state to raid and lock up any building used by enemies of the state.
Anybody that disagreed with Duplessis on anything was automatically labeled a communist. So they threatened on a number of occasions to use the Padlock Law to close up any halls that Jehovah's Witnesses were using, but they never actually padlocked any of them on our account.
Duplessis also orders police to monitor witness activity closely. Officers throughout Quebec now arrest Jehovah's Witnesses for bylaw infractions, disturbing the peace, soliciting, and circulating pamphlets without a permit. John Howe is arrested 13 times during the campaign.
We used to go in East Montreal, you know, you go up sometimes 3 flights of stairs to an apartment, and we would look down and we saw a police car. We'd try to engage the lady in a conversation to stay in there as long as we could till they went away, and then we'd come out.
Glenn Howe, John's brother, is a young lawyer involved in the cause.
My brother was involved in it. I was concerned, of course, but I was also concerned about many of the other young folks that I knew at the time who were being abused, young women held in prison with prostitutes and so on. It was a rough time.
Bien, nous amener au poste de police. Alors, il nous amenait, puis il nous amenait dans les chambres, puis il nous battait.
After an arrest, Saumur and others turned to fellow Jehovah's Witness Frank Roncarelli to post bail.
Frank Roncarelli était un restaurateur montréalais qui était plutôt prospère. Son restaurant de la rue Crescent avait une clientèle assez aisée et depuis de nombreuses années. Donc, il avait des revenus disponibles pour payer les cautionnements des témoins de Jéhovah d'une part, et il avait également des installations avec son restaurant pour organiser la distribution de dépliants de témoins de Jéhovah.
My father was a prosperous gentleman. He owned apartment buildings. His mother, he inherited the restaurant from his mother, and he got into the restaurant business from his engineering profession, but he had a prosperous lifestyle. He owned property.
Frank was a very intelligent man, and he was very spiritual, believe it or not, for a man of his caliber and his economic position. He was very, very spiritual.
He believed what he was doing was right. This was his religious belief. What he was doing was right, and he believed that was it. And what he, you know, and you have freedom in this country under the British North America Act, the separation of church and state. I can practice. I'm not hurting anybody.
Maurice Duplessis' heavy-handedness evokes painful memories for Frank Roncarelli. Back in Italy, he had fled the political strong-arm tactics of dictator Benito Mussolini. But in Quebec, Roncarelli decides to fight. He keeps posting bail as Jehovah's Witness arrests pile up.
And this is what, God willing, as he would say, this is what Jehovah directs, this is what I'll do. And that was his attitude.
Frank Roncarelli's defiance has made him a high-profile target. The Duplessis government is about to make him pay for it. September 7th, 1945. Châteauguay, a small community south of Montreal, becomes a battleground in the conflict between the Duplessis government and Jehovah's Witnesses. A mob of 1,000 people converge on a Jehovah's Witness meeting and start throwing rocks and tomatoes.
C'est le clergé, une organisation religieuse, là, qui ont pourvu les tomates dans un camion, puis les gens nous ont envoyé des tomates sur nous. Alors, ce qui est arrivé, nous, éventuellement, on a pris la route pour s'en aller, mais là, il y a des gens qui ont sauté sur moi, ils ont sauté sur d'autres, et ils ont frappé. Il y en a un qui m'a donné un coup de poing derrière la tête.
The mob gangs up on Saumur. He is badly beaten and spends several days recovering.
Mais c'est ce qui est arrivé, là, pas rien que moi. Il y a des gens, plusieurs personnes qui ont été maltraitées, là, bousculées, houspillées, si vous voulez. Ils ont tout fait ça.
A week later, 1,500 protesters show up at the Jehovah's Witnesses' next meeting in Châteauguay.
I just remember the mob, and there was a few of us there. Frank Roncarelli was there.
I was sent back to the car, waiting for my father, and my brother and father were there, and the mob formed, led by the priest and the policeman, the provincial policeman, as the picture shows. It could have turned into something that could have been menacing, because maybe the police would have stepped in at that point. At that point, they were not really doing it. They were walking in front of the crowd. They weren't holding it back. My brother was hit in the face and the eye with a tomato, and luckily some person drove through the crowd, and my father and brother jumped on the running board, which they had on that car, and the car drove him over to where our car was, and we got in the car and drove away.
Police respond to the Châteauguay riot by throwing more Jehovah's Witnesses in jail. Each court appearance is fraught with tension.
A case of Jehovah's Witnesses, you'd see everybody scared and worried, and the police were there. They'd have a mob of policemen around like we were going to drop bombs or something. But this is what they'd been told.
Frank Roncarelli is kept busy posting bail at the Montreal courthouse 390 times between 1945 and 1946.
You see, the police were fed up with all these arrests and cases of Jehovah's Witnesses. They knew that we weren't hurting anybody and that there was no good reason for it. And so they got tired of processing all these cases.
They used to phone him up and say, Frank, the jails are full. Come down and bail him out. He'd go down and sign. It was all property bail. No money changed hands.
City authorities strike a deal with Roncarelli to speed up the process.
Mr. Roncarelli would go to the courthouse, and they'd give him a blank pad of these things, and he'd put his signature on all of them. And then whenever one of Jehovah's Witnesses came in, they just tear it off and write the person's name on it, and they could go out.
Back on the street, some Jehovah's Witnesses are often rearrested the same day. Léonce Plante is one of the many judges who is tired of the parade.
One time, he was annoyed when Jehovah's Witnesses were in front of him. He says, "Why, you're a bunch of crazy nuts." This was the language that he used off the bench. So this got a lot of press across the country, too.
Il y avait à ce moment-là au-delà de 800 causes pendantes. Et là, on voulait informer le public. On voulait dire aux gens, la haine ardente, ce sont l'action, de la façon que les juges nous traitaient, la façon que les policiers nous traitaient.
A 4-page pamphlet entitled La haine ardente du Québec, or Quebec's Burning Hate, hits the streets in early November 1946. The force behind Quebec's suicidal hate is priest domination. Thousands of Quebec Catholics are so blinded by the priests that they serve God's cause in mobbing Jehovah's Witnesses.
Les gens, le commun peuple en général, ne le savaient pas ce qui se passait. Alors là, on a distribué ce pamphlet-là dans le but d'informer les gens.
C'était une insulte épouvantable à l'époque. Aujourd'hui, on peut comprendre qu'on critique la religion ou des choses du genre, mais à l'époque, c'était pratiquement, écoutez, des gens de l'extérieur qui pensaient qu'eux avaient raison sur les catholiques et les protestants dans leur façon de croire et de professer leur religion. Alors imaginez, c'est le diable dans la bergerie ou dans l'église, ni plus ni moins à l'époque.
The Watchtower Society, the Jehovah's Witness headquarters near Toronto, prints 1 million copies in English, 500,000 in French. It sparks an explosive reaction from Duplessis. He declares a war without mercy against Jehovah's Witnesses. Because this pamphlet is seditious, I have instructed the Assistant Attorney General to employ every means necessary to find the guilty parties and put an end to their unbearable actions. Across Quebec, police seize and destroy thousands of burning hate pamphlets. They find a shipment in a house in Sherbrooke, owned by Frank Roncarelli. They zero in on the man they believe is a ringleader. Authorities hatch a plan to punish Roncarelli, to strike where he's most vulnerable, his restaurant liquor license. Quebec Liquor Commission manager Edouard Archambault consults his boss, Maurice Duplessis.
C'est Archambault qui lui aurait donné l'idée d'enlever le permis de boissons alcooliques du restaurant de Roncarelli. D'autre part, Duplessis, quand il a décidé que c'était une bonne idée, c'est lui qui a donné l'ordre à Archambault de le faire.
On December 4th, 1946, liquor inspectors show up at Roncarelli's restaurant. They cancel his license and cart away almost $3,000 worth of wine, beer, and spirits.
It wasn't right. He was always upset because they'd confiscated several $1,000s worth of liquor, and he was supposed to get paid back for it. He never got the money. I remember that always saying, that really bugged him, was they'd taken all this good wine he'd imported and everything else, and they never remunerated him for it, which they were supposed to.
But Duplessis says Roncarelli is reaping the consequences of his own actions. The communists, the Nazis, as well as those who are the propagandists for the Witnesses of Jehovah, have been treated as they deserved. The restaurant isn't Roncarelli's only business venture, but the raid triggers a financial freefall.
The major international mortgage companies canceled their mortgages. They withdrew their money. Friends he'd gone to school with, presidents of corporations, because he went to Lord Canada College in McGill before he went back to Italy. They were afraid. They gave him support. Frank, we're behind you. We're all behind you. Just don't stop and talk to me on the street where people can see me. And it was that kind of atmosphere that Duplessis had engendered, you know, because of his power.
Duplessis thinks he's delivered a mortal wound, but Roncarelli will give the premier the fight of his life. The war without mercy escalates through December of 1946. It causes outrage in the English press across Canada. The Globe and Mail, December 19th, 1946. This is a monstrous outrage on civil liberties. The Inquisition put heretics to death, while Quebec only puts them in jail. No place is safe for witnesses in Quebec. In the heart of the Beauce region, one family is about to feel Duplessis' wrath.
Aimé Boucher was a little French farmer. He lived right down in the heart of Catholic Quebec. And he was the only Jehovah's Witness for 60 miles around. And he had distributed some of the burning hate pamphlets.
Two of his daughters, Lucille and Giselle, are the first to feel the heat.
Mes sœurs, il avait été présenté le journal, là, La haine en dedans du Québec. C'était à peu près 10 000 où ce que c'est qu'on restait qui avait été. Puis ils ont été arrêtés par la police, puis on ne savait pas, nous autres, mes parents ne savaient pas. Ils les ont pris, ils les ont emmenés en prison. C'est le lendemain qu'on a su qu'il avait été arrêté.
On December 11th, Aimé Boucher is on his way to the courthouse to bail out his daughters. He only gets as far as the train station.
Puis, je me rappelle, il y a deux polices en civil qui sont arrivés. Puis, ils ont dit à mon père de suivre. Ça fait que là, il savait qu'il était arrêté. Ça fait qu'avant de partir là, de la gare, il est venu nous dire salut. Puis, il l'a emmené en prison comme ça.
For Thérèse Boucher's sisters, the charges are dropped. Her father is still in jail.
Je me rappelle qu'on avait été le visiter, oui. Il était en prison, puis il était en train de lire sa Bible. C'est ça que j'ai remarqué. Il était de bonne humeur, ça. Puis il lisait sa Bible.
Aimé Boucher is facing serious charges. Duplessis has raised the stakes in his war against Jehovah's Witnesses.
When Duplessis then decided to get heavy-handed and lay these seditious libel charges, he shot himself in the foot because now he had the kind of charges that were appealable to the Supreme Court of Canada. And so once we could get them out of Quebec, then we could get justice.
Aimé Boucher prepares for a fight that will take him to the Supreme Court. By mid-December, there are 1,000 cases before Quebec courts. John Howe is ensnared in Quebec City.
I was going door to door, offering free home Bible studies to anybody who was interested. And this boy, whose father was engaged in that, in l'Action Catholique, he came out and he started to fight with me. And his mother came out with a broom, and then he picked up my briefcase, and he ran to the police station, and I chased him down to the police station, and he laid a charge against me. I laid a charge against him. We never heard about the charge against him, but I was brought up before Mercier.
Judge Jean Mercier says if he could, he would put Jehovah's Witnesses away for life. John Howe gets 3 months in jail.
They put me in a cell block with 12 other men. One was accused, was a taxi driver. He was accused of rape. Another was a hotel keeper. He was accused of having cut his wife's throat. One was a priest who was in there for black marketeering.
In his New Year's address, Duplessis promises to keep up the pressure on the most hated group in the province. Zealots of a subversive philosophy have launched repeated and virulent attacks against the traditions of our province, attacking Quebec because they know and sense that Quebec is the protector of Christian civilization in Canada and even the entire American continent. These people follow an untrue path.
Lorsque l'exemple vient d'en haut, lorsque le premier ministre de la province de Québec dit on peut frapper un témoin de Jéhovah, le toucher dans son gagne-pain, même si la raison n'a rien à voir avec la vente de boissons alcooliques, ça donne le signal à toute une population que tout est permis contre ces gens-là.
In Montreal, Frank Roncarelli's restaurant is in trouble.
It's Montreal. People go out for a 2-hour lunch, they want a bottle of wine. You know, if they couldn't get it, they'd go elsewhere for lunch or for dinner. So the business sort of slowly petered out. He got his staff placed, got everybody in jobs, and made sure everybody was looked after, and 3-4 months later he closed it down.
Forced to sell his restaurant at a loss, Roncarelli instructs his lawyer, Frank Scott, to sue Quebec Liquor Commissioner Edouard Archambault.
He tried to sue the government and couldn't because Duplessis was Attorney General and wouldn't allow him to sue the Liquor Control Board, who he tried to sue. And then, whether it was Frank Scott or whoever got the idea that we sue Mr. Duplessis personally, or the Premier, as Mr. Duplessis for using his position as Premier and Attorney General to foster his own personal religious beliefs. And that is a big no-no under the British North America Act.
In June of 1947, Roncarelli sues the most powerful man in Quebec for $90,000.
Maurice Duplessis, lorsqu'il a pris la décision qui a accepté qu'on suspende le permis ou qu'on retire le permis à Frank Roncarelli, ne se doutait pas que Frank Roncarelli irait en cours. Pour la simple et bonne raison que ça se faisait couramment d'enlever des permis de boissons à des restaurateurs ou à des gens qui avaient des clubs où il y avait de la boisson. Et je pense qu'il a été lui-même surpris. C'est un cas unique dans l'histoire où un restaurateur a contesté le pouvoir politique.
Je ne sais pas si M. Roncarelli savait dans quoi il se lançait en termes de longueur du processus judiciaire lorsqu'il a intenté des poursuites contre M. Duplessis à la fin des années 1940. Mais de toute façon, il avait perdu son restaurant pour de bon. Et donc, c'est une question d'honneur davantage qu'une question d'argent.
Roncarelli's duel with Duplessis is also destined for the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, his fortunes are plummeting.
He tried various things, couldn't do business in Quebec, in Canada. In Canada, he couldn't do business, not just in Quebec. So he moved to the States and tried to do some projects there.
In Quebec City, Maurice Duplessis amends legislation to increase the penalty for distributing pamphlets without a permit to $1,000 or 3 months in jail. Laurier Saumur ignores the law. He's arrested 103 times. Sillery Prison is becoming Saumur's second home.
Celui qui barrait l'époque, il venait presque à tous les jours s'asseoir dans ma chambre, puis il me posait toutes sortes de questions, parce qu'il se demandait que c'était impossible. Il se demandait, il dit, vous ne devriez pas être ici, à la prison. Mais il constatait qu'on était enfreint de la liberté, puis il voyait l'injustice qu'il se manifestait par les dirigeants, et en particulier Duplessis, évidemment, et les chefs religieux qui poussaient même les juges à essayer de mettre fin à nos activités.
Saumur decides to counter the harassment. He targets a Quebec City bylaw that authorizes the chief of police to censor contents of any pamphlet. Saumur's case will become the third Supreme Court challenge to Duplessis' war without mercy against Jehovah's Witnesses. As the 1950s begin, Aimé Boucher, Frank Roncarelli, and Laurier Saumur are poised to challenge the power of Maurice Duplessis. His war without mercy is into its 6th year. The Premier has no idea who he's up against.
He picked on the wrong people.
The Jehovah's Witnesses see biblical parallels in their plight.
méfiez-vous des hommes, car ils vous livreront à des tribunaux locaux. Et c'est ce qui est arrivé dans notre cas. Ils vous fouetteront dans les synagogues. Vous serez traînés devant les gouverneurs, devant des rois, à cause de moi, en témoignage pour eux et pour les nations. Alors pour nous, on croyait, on voulait cette liberté-là dans le but de témoigner à ces rois, à ces dirigeants, à ces chefs. On voulait suivre, mettre en marche, en branle, les instructions que Jésus avait données à ses apôtres.
June 1950. Glenn Howe is before the 9 judges of Canada's Supreme Court. He's arguing the Aimé-Boucher case. It's the first time the Supreme Court has been called upon to rule on a case involving the fundamental issue of religious freedom.
The court was packed. There was tremendous interest in this case. There was reporters and public that were standing around the edges, and there was a lot of publicity.
The Supreme Court justices deliberate for 6 months. Finally, on December 18th, 1950, by a narrow 5-4 ruling, the court hands down to Duplessis his first defeat in his battle against Jehovah's Witnesses.
Ah, c'était la victoire, on était contents. Oui, je me rappelle quand on avait pris ça à la radio. Dans ce temps-là, il n'y avait pas de télévision, on écoutait la radio des nouvelles, puis quand on a su qu'il avait gagné en Cour suprême, on était contents.
When we won that case, it was a declaration that there was nothing seditious in the document, and all 123 cases that Duplessis had filed all had to go out the window and be withdrawn.
But Duplessis won't let this setback finish a war he wages with the approval of Quebec voters, who keep returning him to power. For Duplessis, putting down his enemies is politically convenient.
Est-ce qu'il s'en vient des élections? Est-ce qu'on est après des élections? C'est tout ça qu'il faut regarder. Souvent, Duplessis agissait, allait parler des communistes ou allait parler des témoins de Jéhovah quand il y avait un problème majeur.
Faisons la sourde oreille aux propagandistes d'idéologie subversive ou athée. Aucun être humain ne pourra éteindre l'étoile de Bethléem. Elle continuera à briller dans cet éclat longtemps après que seront disparus à jamais ceux qui veulent en amoindrir la lumière, et la province de Québec demeurera la forteresse de la civilisation chrétienne au Canada et même sur tout le continent américain.
Jehovah's Witnesses win new converts in Quebec, but their legal problems aren't over yet. Another 1,000 cases are depending on the Saumur ruling. Meanwhile, Roncarelli's suit against Duplessis has reached the province's highest court. On May 2nd, 1951, Quebec's Superior Court fines for Roncarelli, but only awards him a fraction of the damages sought. Duplessis is enraged at his loss and appeals to the Supreme Court. So does Roncarelli.
He cross-appealed for more money because $9,000, whatever it was a pittance. But the judge, again, felt that my father was right, but didn't want to anger the government too much because he was a government appointee.
Duplessis uses his legal resources to delay the case for as long as he can. But he can't hold off the Supreme Court from ruling on the Saumur case. On October 6, 1953, the Supreme Court hands down another narrow 5-4 ruling in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses.
When the Supreme Court ruled that the censorship was illegal, there was 1,100 cases, all of which had to be withdrawn.
Oh mon Dieu, c'est une véritable délivrance. Ça a été très agréable parce qu'en réalité, c'était loi. On était libre d'aller de maison en maison et que eux, il était défendu pour eux, le clergé, de s'opposer à ce qu'on le fasse.
Duplessis still thinks he has the power to get rid of Jehovah's Witnesses.
We had defeated him on all the laws he knew. He decided he was going to make another law, which he did at the beginning of 1954. He enacted a new law that was known as Bill 38. It was really an amendment to the Freedom of Worship Act where he tried to take away all the rights that were granted under it.
Duplessis' inspiration comes right out of the Dark Ages.
as I hunted around, I found that this was paralleled by Torquemada's instructions to the Spanish Inquisition, because people could be arrested and held in prison with no charge. They would have to prove themselves not guilty while never being told what they were charged with.
Glenn Howe petitions for an injunction against Bill 38 and subpoenas du Plessis himself to testify at the hearing.
C'était la première fois qu'un premier ministre de l'Empire britannique avait besoin de se défendre devant les tribunaux. Et du Plessis y est allé 2 fois en raison des témoins de Jéhovah. La première fois dans l'affaire Oncarelli, puis ensuite il a dû aller défendre sa loi, ou son amendement à la loi de la liberté religieuse, Bill 38, dans les tribunaux. Alors, c'est exceptionnel.
He was highly outraged, and as the case went on and I kept asking him questions, and he said, "You're a very impertinent young man." And I said, "Well, Mr. du Plessis, if we were going to get down to personalities, I might have a few remarks of my own, but since we have business to attend to, would you please instead tell us why you didn't answer the last question?" And of course then object to it. It went on as before.
The injunction succeeds, and Bill 38 is never enacted. Even the padlock law is ruled unconstitutional. Du Plessis has lost the tools to wage his war without mercy, but there's still one unresolved conflict. On January 27, 1959, the Supreme Court awards Frank Roncarelli more than $45,000 in damages and costs, calling the raid on his restaurant 12 years earlier a gross abuse of du Plessis' legal power.
And when the judgment came through, it was like a relief. It wasn't sort of a relief from a burden on him. It was a relief that, yes, I was right. You know, he did what he was right. He knew he was right. He was proved right. The rest, if that's what it cost him, that's what it cost him. That's the cost of being right and sticking up for what you believe.
Frank Roncarelli, on en parle rarement de ça, mais il a tout perdu sa fortune. Frank Roncarelli était pratiquement millionnaire. Et ça lui a coûté 700 000 ou 800 000 $ de frais d'avocat et de frais en justice.
Du Plessis' loss is not financial. His party, l'Union Nationale, pays the damages. Du Plessis still hopes to make political gains, suggesting he might appeal to the Privy Council in London.
Il considérait que c'était lui la partie lésée dans tout ça, que la Cour suprême penchait toujours du même côté, etc. Alors, il cherchait à jouer la victime et avec peut-être comme vision à court terme ou à moyen terme, lors des élections suivantes, d'en récolter un capital politique.
But in the late 50s, du Plessis' power is in decline.
Il est beaucoup plus contesté comme pouvoir établi. Alors, il y a énormément de forces qui le contestent. Donc, quand le jugement de Frank Roncarelli sort, du Plessis n'a plus le même pouvoir qu'il avait lorsqu'il a contesté dans les années 40.
Du Plessis will not live to continue his fight against Jehovah's Witnesses. His death, 7 months after Roncarelli's win, brings an end to an era Quebec society now remembers as La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness. Du Plessis' death does not put an immediate end to the harassment against Jehovah's Witnesses.
La génération qui a vécu ces événements-là a continué à donner raison à du Plessis, même après la mort de du Plessis, même après la fin de l'affaire Oncarelli. Dans un sondage de 1964 de Maurice Pinard, 68% des Québécois considéraient qu'on devait restreindre la liberté religieuse des témoins de Jéhovah. Ça, c'est 5 ans après la fin de l'affaire Oncarelli.
A few years after the Supreme Court victories, John Howe still encounters resistance from a priest while going door to door.
He said, "Look, you either get in the car and go back home," or he says, "I won't be responsible for what's going to happen to you." And I said to him, "Look," I said, "you know, you have the Virgin Mary on your side. You say you have God on your side, and you have Jesus Christ on your side. Why do you need to defend your religion avec les coups de poing, with fists?" Well, he got so mad, he slammed the door and he took off. We never saw him again.
Jehovah's Witnesses now have the law on their side. In the early 1960s, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker's government enacts the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing religious freedom in Canada.
Our cases highlighted for the Canadian public the fact that we didn't have a Bill of Rights. Lots of people thought we did have. So it just opened the door to the Bill of Rights that Diefenbaker adopted in 1960, as well as the Charter of Rights. So all these things really resulted from the battle that we put on.
Frank Roncarelli never moved back to the country he helped change. He died at his home in Connecticut in 1981.
His legacy, hard to say. I'm very proud of him. I have a lot of respect for him. Changed my life around. I keep bumping into people, particularly in Canada. Every lawyer I meet, Roncarelli, are you any relation to? People know about it, students study it in school, and I'm sort of proud of the fact that, you know, he did it. And I want my children to understand what this gentleman did for them.
The Catholic Church lost much of its power in Quebec society, making it easier for Jehovah's Witnesses to hold large meetings, like this one in the late 60s. Jehovah's Witnesses are no longer public enemy number one, and neither is Laurier Saumur. He preached in Quebec until his retirement.
Nous croyons sincèrement que Dieu doit intervenir dans les affaires des hommes. On croyait cela, on croit cela encore.
Bonsoir. Bonsoir. Comment allez-vous?
There are now 35,000 Jehovah's Witnesses living in Quebec, and the legal expertise Glenn Howe gained there is valuable to other witnesses.
Well, I'm consulted from time to time on cases in other parts of the world, and our experience with both writing and practicing under and developing the Canadian Constitution has made it possible for me to speak with considerable authority in other countries, too.
In 1997, a battle erupts in a town north of Montreal that requires Glenn Howe's attention. The mayor of Blainville directs police to prosecute Jehovah's Witnesses for preaching door to door without a permit.
Well, we just have another Junior Duplessis there who's trying to reestablish censorship. It's very interesting. He wants to censor Jehovah's Witnesses, meanwhile assuring all the politicians that they can go from house to house without a permit. So he's got a law that he wants to apply in a very selective way, which is known as discrimination.
On dirait que peut-être Blainville, c'est l'exception qui confirme la règle, hein, parce que les témoins de Jéhovah semblent aussi zélés que dans les années 40, puis les autorités municipales ont l'air aussi zélées que dans les années 40.
We'll see how the case goes. I might tell you it's so well known what our cases have done. I have had Quebec judges thank me and Jehovah's Witnesses for what we've done in the province of Quebec.